Good evening and welcome, everyone. I am William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation. It's a real pleasure to have all of you here. We're so glad to have you here for this evening's presentation of former Colored School Number 4, a newly designated city landmark with Eric K. Washington. Before we get started, I'm just going to do a quick intro and a little Zoom protocol, and then I will hand it over to this evening's speaker. So since we're all on Zoom and stuff, please feel free to pop in where you're tuning in from in the chat. The chat will be monitored the whole evening here. And yeah, just let us know where you're tuning in from. We always love to know people from the city and far and wide. If you're not familiar with Village Preservation has been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We've secured landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings in the neighborhoods and zoning protections for over 100 blocks. We host about 75 free programs such as this throughout the entire year. So we hope you'll join us for future programs. We have a whole bunch just coming up next week. So our events cover a wide range of topics from history, architecture, and culture of the neighborhood, and the important role of historic preservation, which we'll be talking about tonight, in our communities and lives. And we also touch upon everything from local small businesses to independent cultural institutions, civil rights, social justice movements, artists, writers, musicals, dancers, and all the other great connected creative legacies of our neighborhoods. We are a member-based organization, so if you are a member, a very big thank you to all of you out there because you do help make this possible. If you are not a member, please do consider joining and becoming a member. Let's see if I can. Oh. So you can scan that QR code right there on your screen, and it will take you to our donation page where you can become a member, donate, and then you can also check out the website, learn about all our upcoming programs. So before we get started, just a few Zoom protocols. If you have any questions for this evening's speaker throughout the presentation, please go to the bottom of your screen. You'll see the little Q&A function there. Pop your question right in there. We're going to collect those questions and then ask them at the end of the evening. The chat is active. I already see a whole bunch of chats, which I'll review in a second. But please feel free to put your thoughts and reactions there in the chat. So now for this evening's speaker. So tonight we're joined by Eric K. Washington. He's an independent scholar and author who first brought former Colored School Number 4 to both the attention of Landmarks Commission and to wide public awareness. He spearheaded the collaborative community support, including with Village Preservation, that led to the building's landmark designation. Mayor Adams has allocated $6 million for its rehabilitation. Eric Watt has also received the Historic District Council's 2023 Grassroots Preservation Award and the Victorian Society of New York's 2022 Preservation Award. So Eric, we welcome you. I'm going to stop sharing this one, and then we'll get your presentation set up here.
Oh, it's alive. Hi. We were having some tech problems. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric K. Washington, and I really want to thank the Village Preservation community and members for inviting me to speak, and especially for being an essential part of the collaborative community support that effectively ushered former Colored School Number 4 building to landmark designation last May. I think since many of you have already heard, on May 23rd, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission voted unanimously to designate the building an individual landmark. And what's more, on that same day, Mayor Adams pledged $6 million for the building's rehabilitation. So my following slideshow will give you an overview of my introduction to the site, its historic significance, and some of the processes towards getting it designated. I first became aware of this schoolhouse about 5 or 6 years ago while researching my book, Boss of the Grips, The Life of James H. Williams in the Red Caps of Grand Central Terminal, a biography whose protagonist had been one of the late 19th century pupils and graduates of the school. And in November 2018, I appealed to the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission to consider the building for designation. Bolstered by newspaper accounts, city resources at the municipal archives, which were especially invaluable to me, from 1940 tax photos that proved the building was the same one as it is today, the Board of Education records that informed me who worked and even lived in there, and to vital records such as birth, death, and marriage certificates that helped me to put the building in context with the surrounding neighborhood. And that surrounding neighborhood, of course, includes Greenwich Village, as well as Chelsea, where it's located, and the Flatiron District that many of you all know well. And by extension, it includes Harlem, where I live, because of the people who were connected to it and where they or their offspring ended up. So I'm happy to share some of this information that might shed more light on those areas in bygone days. So as a Black New Yorker, I know there are woefully too few extant properties that reflect the complex historical trajectory, milestones, and breadth of our great city's African-American experience. But I also know that unlikely doorways often reveal essential but not forgotten stories, as demonstrated by some of the many people and events you're about to meet that have passed through the doors of the former Colored School number 4 schoolhouse. William, change slides, please. So there it is. Many of you, if you live in the neighborhood on 17th Street, may have passed by without noticing it. If you blinked, you miss it. Next slide, please. Oh, that's the one. I'm sorry. Back up. Yeah. So for 34 years, from 1860 to 1894, the 3-story building at 128 West 17th Street embodied New York City's official racial caste education system that covered most of the 19th century. Today, the building is called Colored School number 4 for expediency. However, it was known successively in its time as Colored School number 7, then Colored School number 4, and finally as Grammar School number 81. The old schoolhouse duly served the numerous working-class African-American families that were once concentrated in the West Side blocks that were then on the fringe of the city's dubious Tenderloin precinct, now part of Chelsea. And its decades-long use spanned the antebellum and the Civil War eras, the Reconstruction era, the Gilded Age, and the Progressive era. And the 17th Street building represents Manhattan's only surviving colored schoolhouse, and possibly the borough's oldest extant public education facility as well. Colored School number 4 was integral to an informal plexus of other African-American schools, churches, enterprises, missions, and societies that gave anchor to Lower Manhattan's growing Black enclaves as they drifted upwards to West Side neighborhoods such as Hell's Kitchen and San Juan Hill. Indeed, a myriad of citizen leaders who effectively fashioned the even farther uptown community of Harlem into the renowned 20th century capital of Black America, where the alumni or their offspring were of this late 19th century school. But how did the school come about? Next slide. Historically, Colored School number 4 was one of a series of schoolhouses that evolved from the African free school system that was established in 1787 by the New York Manumission Society to educate Black children, both enslaved and free, at the beginning of what became a protracted process of gradually abolishing New York State's race-based slavery system. The structure is a rare example of an 1843 design called the Model Primary Schoolhouse, which the Public School Society adopted the next year as an efficient plan for primary school buildings to be dispersed around the city, which was then just Manhattan. But in 1853, the Board of Education came to preside over the Public School Society, absorbing 224 of the latter's properties, of which 25 were for African Americans. Next slide, please. The Board of Education's 1854 annual report shows that the former schoolhouse on West 17th Street was built in 1849 to 50. It's that little, that horizontal white strip, the top left of the screen there, which is, don't squint, you can't read it. It cites the $4,400 construction of the three-story schoolhouse at 98 West 17th Street, which in 1868 was changed to become 128 West 17th Street. And the lot's corresponding footprint also appears on an 1852 map by Matthew Drips. Now, even though the 17th Street building was most famously a school for Black children, its first 10 years housed various schools for white students. The same 1852 Drips map indicates its use by public primary school number 27 and 28. And 5 years later, municipal records and maps show the building's shared use in 1857 by primary schools numbers 25 and number 26. And by 1859, the building housed primary school number 14. And this last one gave way the next year to its longest lasting use as a so-called colored school. And I just want to draw your attention to the map on the left. You can see the proximity of the school to the blue line in the circled area on 15th Street is the African Union Methodist Church. So you could see that it was in very close proximity to a Black community that was prevalent in the neighborhood at the time. Next slide, please. So this 1853 rendering of that 1843 design depicts an identical facade to the present building that you see today at 128 West 17th Street. Give or take some variations, the dispersed schoolhouses basically followed the prescribed exterior and interior plans, which colored school number 4 also mirrored. Next slide, please. An 1879 map reveals the close proximity of the school and the African Union Methodist Church. So I put it twice, I'm sorry, giving a sense of the neighborhood's Black population. And keeping that 1843 design in mind, here's how the old schoolhouse appeared in 1908, 1940, and today. Next slide, please. So I should, at this point, say that when the Board of Education took charge of the schools in 1853, it coincided with active public education initiatives already underway by the city's African-American community. In 1847, the New York Society for the Promotion of Education Among Colored Children had been co-founded by Reverend Charles Bennett Ray, who you see here, one of the most highly influential and wealthy Black New Yorkers of the day. A clergyman who was also a businessman and an activist, Charles B. Ray evokes an array of charismatic Harlem ministers yet to be born. In 1837, Ray became a general agent of the Colored American, a regular periodical. This African-American New York City newspaper was edited by Samuel Cornish, who 10 years earlier had co-founded Freedom's Journal, the country's first Black newspaper. In 1840, Ray was the principal organizer with John J. Zweil, Reverend Theo S. Wright, Charles L. Reason, and Timothy Seaman of the New York State Colored Convention at Albany, part of the National Colored Conventions movement that had begun in 1830. And during the 1830s, Ray was also an ardent abolitionist with David Ruggles on the New York Committee of Vigilance, formed of Blacks and whites to assist fugitive slaves, Frederick Douglass being an example, and to thwart kidnappers from abducting free Blacks and trafficking them to the South. If you think of 12 Years a Slave, scenarios like that. In 1863, Martin Luther King would say, "It is appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning." However, for over 20 years, from 1845 to 1868, Ray was the pastor of two predominantly white congregations. Under Ray, they were in fellowship with a cohort of Black churches in Greenwich Village as centers of anti-slavery and Black men's suffrage activism. One suspects that they were congregations of abolitionists, as such was the company Ray kept. And Ray also arbitrated purchases of lots in upstate New York from white abolitionist Gerrit Smith, which enabled Black men to satisfy the New York State's $250 property qualification to vote. The letter that you see in the middle there at an angle is one that Ray wrote in 1848 on behalf of William Appo, a musician of some renown who later became Colored School No. 4's music instructor, indeed a music instructor for several of the so-called colored schools. Charles B. Ray was also the father of three notable daughters, Charlotte E. Ray, Florence Therese Ray, for whom I can't find an image yet, and Henrietta Cordelia Ray. All three of them were educators, writers, and suffragists. Charlotte, the eldest, notably became the country's first Black woman lawyer, and Florence, the middle daughter, became a teacher at Colored School No. 4 on West 17th Street. Cordelia, the youngest of the three, gained acclaim as a poet. Her ode, Lincoln, was read at the 1876 unveiling of the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C. But back to their father, apropos of the colored schools. In 1847, Ray co-founded and became president of the New York Society for the Promotion of Education Among Colored Children, which opened two schools on Thomas Street and on Center Street. In 1855, the society began awarding the annual Ridgway Prize, which you see at the right of the screen, bequeathed in the will of a Scottish hairdresser named Charles Ridgway, as incentives to Black children in the Board of Education's various racial caste public schools. I've only tracked the prize for 4 years so far, up until 1859, but I believe it likely contributed to the new school on 17th Street the following year. Next slide, please. It was in September 1860 that the Board of Ed elevated the former colored primary school No. 1 that was located in the basement of the African Union Methodist Church that I pointed out by merging it with a new ward grammar school at the 17th Street schoolhouse. This would be called Colored School No. 7 under Principal Charlotte S. Smith, whose silhouette you see at the lower left of the screen. In addition to the new Colored Ward School No. 7's day school for children was an evening school for adults. And a huge celebration was thrown just before Christmas in 1860 to mark the close of the evening school's first term. And a guest remarked that the schoolhouse was filled to its utmost capacity, there being not less than 500 present, to witness members of the night school. He was especially impressed to see so large a number of grown persons, some 60 and 70 years of age, receiving their certificates of regular attendance. And one might also imagine a measure of that reception's significance by the participation of Reverend Dr. James W.C. Pennington in the upper left corner of the screen. The then Greenwich Village-based minister, orator, writer, educator, and abolitionist of international renown, who came to say the benedictions for the school. Ultimately, however, the school's driving spirit was its redoubtable principal, Sarah J.S. Tompkins. You see center screen. On April 30th, 1863, her 31-year tenure began when she was appointed to replace Charlotte Smith, the recently deceased principal at Colored School No. 7. And as it happened, within Tompkins's first few months, current events put her on her mettle. Next slide, please. In July of that year, 1863, the American Civil War had been sundering the nation at large for 2 years. A provision of the law allowed men eligible for the draft to get out of it by paying $300, equivalent to about $7,300 today. This was beyond the means of most, and other factors aside, it helped to ignite what would be immortalized in infamy as the draft riots of 1863, 5 days of bloody mayhem and murder that left an indelible scar on the nation's conscience. What was arguably the most famous casualty occurred the first day of the riots. On July 13th, at about 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the rabble overtook the Colored Orphan Asylum up on 5th Avenue and 43rd Street. Irrespective of the children inside, the crowd fiendishly torched the orphanage and plundered what it could before the flames burnt the building to the quick of its foundation. Fortunately, the orphan asylum staff had ushered all the kids out through a back door to safety. But that vicious act was just a warm-up. By evening, the horror of the mobs was in Greenwich Village. Next slide, please. Covering the infamous draft riot of 1863, the New York Times noted numerous outrages upon colored persons who were wantonly set upon, beaten, and frequently killed throughout Manhattan. There were probably not less than a dozen Negroes beaten to death in different parts of the city during the day. Among the most diabolical of these outrages that have come to our knowledge is that of a Negro cartman living in Carmine Street. Coming out of the stable after having put up his horses, he was attacked by a crowd of about 400 men and boys, who beat him with clubs and paving stones till he was lifeless, and then hung him to a tree opposite the burying ground. They then set fire to his clothes and danced and yelled and swore their horrid oaths around his burning corpse. The next day promised more of the same, some blocks north on 17th Street. Next slide, please. Sarah Tompkins was barely 3 months into her new position as principal of Colored School Number 7. Now, just to repeat it, because there's so many names, now the former Colored School Number 4 that's landmarked, when the war's ensuing chaos found the school. Despite the previous day's horror, the classrooms were filled with pupils, now seeing a mob of unruly whites trying to get into the building. Tompkins and her teachers no doubt reckoned the worst. One paper wrote, "It seems that 2 colored women whom the mob had pursued had taken refuge in the school building, and they were determined to get at them. The teachers promptly barred all the doors, and the rioters, after a few ineffectual efforts to break in, turned their attention to a little wooden shanty on the opposite side of the street, rushing into it, attacking the inmates, and committing various depredations upon the building." Now, one can barely fathom the confusion and terror of all the pupils inside. In September, some newspapers reported a Thanksgiving festival of the colored children of Ward School Number 7, under the charge of Mrs. Tompkins, in gratitude for their escape from death during the late riots that had been held on Friday in the Sullivan Street, Bethel Methodist Episcopal Church. What one might imagine is the children, decades later as grown-ups, still hearkening back to their dear principal's selflessness in those earlier dangerous times. In 1893, a women's periodical recalled how, on the first day of the riot in New York, Tompkins conducted safely to their homes many children who had attended her school that day before starting for her own residence in Brooklyn. Next slide, please. Oh, before you, on this slide, I should note that in 1893, this was a paper that came out during the year of the World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. We'll talk about this person at the right of the screen later, Imogen Howard, but she was a teacher at the school, but she'd also been chosen by the governor of the state to be a manager at the World's Fair. And so this was like a full generation after the draft riots, and it kind of shows that because of her, her selflessness, Tompkins had really, this story about her had made her a heroine for another generation of people. So it just continued, and this was part of the exhibition. This story about her and other women, Black women of note in New York, that was in the women's building at the fair that year. Next slide, please. By the following spring, the unrest on 17th Street had ended, but just a few blocks east of the schoolhouse, the street was a scene of bustling activity that captivated the pupils. Set up along the 17th Street side of Union Square, the Metropolitan Sanitary Fair of 1864 was a monumental civic festival to aid the Union Army's sick and wounded. Tompkins notably engaged the school in the city's major war relief effort, albeit off-site, farther down at Shiloh Presbyterian Church on Prince Street, which was then under Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, the renowned abolitionist educator and later statesman. Colored School Number 7 gave a musical and dramatic benefit in aid of the soldiers. No doubt for the newly formed 20th U.S. Colored Infantry in particular, who ceremoniously received their colors in front of the Union League Club on 17th Street, across the street from Square. Next slide, please. Soon afterwards, Reverend Garnett, himself a graduate of New York's African Free School, left for a new ministry in Washington, D.C., then for a presidency of Avery College in Pittsburgh, where his wife died in 1870. Returning to New York, Garnett inevitably reconnected with Tompkins, who was ever a community activist throughout her tenure. In March 1871, Tompkins initiated a series of public lectures in the schoolhouse, by now renamed Colored School Number 4. The first speaker was the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, whom Sarah Tompkins married 4 years later, becoming ever after Sarah Garnett. And that's a copy of the marriage certificate that you see there. Also, that photo of the townhouse next to it is 175 McDougal Street in the Village. It's still occupied today, but this is where they live together. They appear on the 1880 census after their marriage. And while living at this address in 1880, Reverend Garnett was championing an ardent relief effort to aid the Arkansas refugees. These were hundreds of poor Black emigres seeking to move to Liberia. Next slide, please. But being turned out of their homes in Arkansas when the purpose of their leaving was known, they reached New York before time for sailing. In ways that sadly ring familiar today, the refugees were quickly disparaged and suffered media accusations of being secretly rich and dishonest. But Reverend Garnett, another Black clergy, and numerous citizens rose to the occasion to provide the refugees funds, food, clothing, and shelter while they waited out their unavoidable displacement. The New York Sun also reported that while waylaid here, many of the refugee children went to school to Mrs. Highland Garnett's Colored School Number 4. Next slide, please. Besides Henry Highland Garnett, other notable visitors associated with the school included Lieutenant Governor Oscar James Dunn of Louisiana, who visited the school in 1869 after visiting with Ulysses S. Grant. So this is in the Reconstruction era. Henry Ossian Flipper, West Point cadet, visited the school. He would become the first Black graduate of West Point. Sir James Bain, Lord Provost of Glasgow, visited the school in 1876. This was the centennial year. And while he was being showed around the city by New York City's mayor of places that, were meant to impress visitors with New York's good attractions, he brought them to Colored School Number 4. J.A. Arnault, who was a Shakespearean actor and a journalist, he was the editor of the New York Enterprise, and Ednora Nahar, an elocutionist. Newspapers also cited the school's engagement during notable events that included presidential inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant in 1869, the memorial to U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, whose name has come up in more recent times. He was a big champion of anti-slavery champion while he was in the Senate, and he was beaten by another senator on the floor of Congress almost lifelessly. They also celebrated the memorial to U.S. President James A. Garfield in 1881, where Sarah Garnett's daughter Serena Tompkins, was an organist. And they participated on stage in Louise A. Smith's The Little Mountain Fairies at Chickering Hall. This was a place where Oscar Wilde appeared when he made his first visit and tour of the States, and was staying nearby in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. For about 6 years, from about 1878 to 1884, the Board of Education wrangled over the colored school question, and not infrequently rankled New York's African-American community in the process in trying to determine how to absorb them into the general system. Should the schools be consolidated, or should they be abolished altogether? Despite their sad origins from the slavery era, these few Jim Crow schools nevertheless took a pride of place in the African-American communities that they served. Many acknowledged that this was owed especially to their diligent core of Black teachers. Yet the board's Committee on Colored Schools conspicuously overlooked Black teachers in its sweeping reform. In 1879, the board's early notions to close the colored schools foresaw the obvious consequence of assimilating Black pupils into the white student body of schools and classrooms. But ironically, it advised there was no probability of the admission of colored teachers to the mixed schools. The exclusion of Black teachers who had made the vocation their life's calling, indeed through the same training and experience as their white counterparts, fueled African-American community leaders and citizens to convene a mass meeting at the venerable Lyric Hall up on 6th Avenue and 42nd Street. It fell to Reverend Henry Highland Garnett to convey their resolutions to the board, whom they urged to keep the existing colored schools open so long as the numbers in attendance justify their continuance. But the status of the schools remained in limbo a few more years. On February 12, 1883, Lincoln's birthday, the lingering proposition to close these schools galvanized Sarah Garnett, now recently Widow Garnett, to another mass protest, this time at Chickering Hall again. Encouraged by a letter from Frederick Douglass, they again implored the Board of Ed either to place Black teachers in equality with white teachers or else to leave the colored schools as they were. Closer to the latter was achieved. Ultimately, in 1884, a legislative act signed by New York Governor Grover Cleveland closed all but two of the separate race-based schools, sparing Colored School number 3 on West 41st Street and Colored School number 4 on West 17th Street, which were thereafter designated Grammar School number 80 and Grammar School number 81, respectively. As for their collective staffs, the Board of Education's annual report noted that the colored schools as such were abolished, and the 20 teachers of those schools are now included in the mixed grammar and primary departments. This claim appears more hypothetical than actual. Whereas it was Black student attendance that now constituted the general public schools as mixed, hiring biases still relegated Black teachers to their two newly numbered grammar schools, until S. Elizabeth Fraser broke the color line a decade later. However, a news item in the New York Freeman suggests, indeed, the transition from colored to grammar school seems less than a seamless name change. In 1885, Cordelia Ray, who I mentioned earlier, won a Supreme Court decision for back salary from the Board of Education, which she proved discharged her the previous year, not according to law. As a result, 3 teachers who were also improperly dropped regained their standing as teachers and resumed work at the 17th Street School, of which Mrs. S.J. Garnett is principal. In the following year, Sarah Garnett personally distributed flyers to persuade parents and guardians of extra seating capacity being available to all. Her efforts rallied support from numerous Black clergy and news editors, such as John J. Freeman of the Progressive American, J.A. Arnault of the New York Enterprise, and T. Thomas Fortune of the New York Freeman, in which a columnist declared, it is lamentable to feel that such an old and honorable landmark should have to appeal to the masses for attendance after its established reputation and the many proud examples turned out in past years. Interestingly, in 1888, both Sarah Garnett and Louise Clausen, the white principal of Grammar School number 48, 11 blocks north on West 28th Street, remarked upon a noticeable attrition of their respective Black students and white students due to the color line. Grammar School number 81, its principal, Garnett, noted, there's a decided decrease in the attendance here, attributable to the throwing open of the general, that is to say, white schools of both white and colored, to both white and colored. This was formerly known as an exclusively colored school, and our pupils came from all parts of the city, but now they have left in order to attend schools nearer their homes. At Grammar School number 48, Clausen cited a very perceptible falling off in the number of white scholars. The former daily average of pupil attendance of 500 had now purportedly fallen off to not more than 300. The colored element was on the increase, the paper reported her to say, claiming the colored children in her school were being educated at the expense of the white children. So both principals Garnett and Clausen appeared to observe their base student demographics diminishing. But whereas Garnett cited Black student attrition at her once exclusively colored school to the community seeking more convenient facilities, such as the better equipped Grammar School number 48, Clausen cited white student attrition as a result of Black student enrollment, a pattern that later generations would term white flight. In 1894, the Board of Education finally closed the former Colored School number 4. It determined the building was no longer required for school purposes and resolved to sell it, but obviously never did. A year later, the New York Herald would report the Grammar School number 48 was now predominated by a 33% attendance, actually not at all a predominant figure, of Black students who, coming from near and far, regarded it as their fashionable school, adding that there were few pupils of purely American parentage, that is to say, white, not Native American. It unfortunately perpetuated the bias of African Americans being a demographic of outliers. For Sarah Garnett's part, she and a number of her teachers transferred the former colored school number 3, to the former colored school number 3 on West 41st Street. And Garnett remained an activist, educator, community leader, and suffragist. In 1895, she co-founded an association to build a community hospital. And later in her native Brooklyn, she and her sister, Susan McKinney Stewart, the state's first Black woman to earn a medical degree, founded the Equal Suffrage League, which in 1908 joined with the National Association of Colored Women to petition the US Congress for women's right to vote. At her memorial in 1911, personal testimonials were heard from her active allies, civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois and redoubtable journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett. This was commensurate with the high reputation that Garnett had built at Colored School number 4. Sorry, next slide, please. By the time the school closed in 1894, Garnett's diligent core of African-American teachers had long made it a singular pillar of the Black community. The school's other remarkable teachers included J. Imogen Howard, who you see here again. In 1868, Bostonian Howard joined the teaching staff at Colored School number 4. She was an award-winning essayist at school and also a musical prodigy. In 1893, Governor Roswell P. Flower appointed her to represent New York State at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and she was the only Black manager at that World's Fair. And then in 1900, she was the only Black winner of the Evening Telegram newspaper's Great Teachers Competition, who was sent to the Paris Exposition. Next slide, please. In 1865, William Appo joined the school's staff. He's described as the most learned musician of the race. He started in the late 1820s with the legendary Black maestro Francis Johnson, the color image that you see in the lower left of the screen. And they were associated with some of America's earliest public concerts by Black musicians, including Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, known as the Black Swan, and toured England together in 1837. In 1839, Appo performed at a public fundraiser here in New York City for the African captives of the Amistad, who were jailed in New Haven. He was also aligned to white abolitionists Gerrit Smith and John Brown near Lake Placid, New York. Appo's daughter, Helen Appo Cook, taught at Manhattan's Colored School number 6, which is part of the same system. And to give you an indication of sort of the odds that were against the teachers and students of this school, in the case of Appo's daughter, who graduated with Elizabeth Jennings, who many of you have heard of, she's often referred to as the Rosa Parks of New York a century earlier, won a famous lawsuit in 1855 that led to the desegregation of New York's public conveyances. She and Helen Appo Cook graduated from their teachers training the same year, and the ceremony was at the Academy of Music, but were not permitted to take place in the ceremony, so they were given their certificates off stage, just because they were the only 2 Black teachers who had graduated in the group. Next slide, please. Susan Elizabeth Frazier descended from New York ancestors who fought in the American Revolution, and she grew up on the same block as the school where she graduated in 1882. In 1895, her landmark lawsuit resulted in her becoming New York City's first Black teacher assigned to a mixed public school. In 1911, she spearheaded a call to action of women's clubs to care for the aged and indigent Harriet Tubman. During the Great War, World War I, Frazier was president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Old 15th National Guard, the African-American troop best known as the 369th Harlem Hellfighters Regiment. She was purportedly the first Black woman to be buried with full military honors. In 1919, that same newspaper, the Evening Telegram, had again its competition based on public votes that sent Frazier on a teacher's delegation to the recently hushed European battlefields. Next slide, please. Some of the notable graduates included Walter F. Craig, the acclaimed violinist and composer, was born on December 20th, 1854 in Princeton, New Jersey. In 1861, his family moved to New York City and enrolled him in colored school number 7 at 98 West 17th Street, where he graduated in 1869, which time it was then known as colored school number 4 at 128 West 17th Street. It said young Craig had taken up the violin in 1868 and debuted in public at a concert in Cooper Union in 1870. His rapid improvement led him to organize his own orchestra in 1872, which showcased his musical talents as first-class conductor and composer. He now enjoys the honor of being the representative colored violin soloist and musical director of the race. His orchestra is quoted as being second to none, and his fame as a soloist extends throughout the entire United States and also some foreign countries. The New York Age was quoted as saying, "Mr. Craig has done much to break down the barriers of caste," citing a circa 1886 achievement when he became the first musician of the race to be admitted to the musical union, which was all white. On June 15th, 1892, Craig was among the first African Americans to perform at New York's Carnegie Hall, appearing on a program featuring the vocalist Cicieretta Jones, widely known as the Black Patti, after the legendary Italian opera singer Adelina Patti. And after noting that, I since noted that even before then he appeared at Carnegie Hall. So there's a page from a program at the right of the screen, and it's highlighted, where he and Desaria Plato, who's pictured at the left of Craig's image, both appeared on this program in May of that same year, 1892. So they were some of the very earliest Black performers at what was still a new Carnegie Hall, which was then called the Chamber Music Hall. And he collaborated with some of the greatest singers of the time, including Madame Marie Salika, who was dubbed the Queen of Staccato, and Flora Batson. Some newspapers noted that in 1893, Czech emigre composer Antonin Dvorak personally recruited Craig for his newly established National Conservatory of Music in America in New York. Craig's famous orchestra, as it was often billed, was one of the preeminent late 19th and early 20th century society orchestras for both Black and white audiences. Next slide, please. And James H. Williams, who's close to my heart, obviously, the eponymous subject of my biography, Boss of the Grips. James H. Williams, the life of James H. Williams and the Redcaps of Grand Central Terminal. As the station's chief Redcap attendant for nearly half a century, Williams presided over Grand Central's essential Harlem-based workforce that produced this city's first Black police officer, Columbia's University's first Black architecture school graduate, and still familiar names such as Paul Robeson and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. So that's my presentation. But I have some bonus tracks which I can flip through because I think some of you may like to see inside. And I had the privilege of being able to visit last December through the efforts of Eric Botcher, city council person. So if you go to the next slide, please. And then the next. So I mentioned earlier that somebody had commented that there was a reception that had about 500 or 600 people there, which I thought maybe was a bit of hyperbole written at the time in 1860. Because as I said, when you walk by, it's easy to miss it. It's such an unassuming and small looking building. But you could see from here that it actually goes through most of the block, and it's fairly cavernous. And this is just one floor. This is the ground floor that you see. So with the same size floors, a second floor and a third floor, you could easily imagine that many people being accommodated. Next slide, please. The back of the building tapers at the end. So these windows give on an alley on each side to sort of a yard. Next slide, please. So you see one of those yards in one direction, and then looking the other direction, there's a stairway that goes up to the second floor landing. Next slide, please. And this was I believe this was the second floor. And so those windows that you see from the street, this is looking northward. So you're looking across the street to the north side of 17th Street, are still basically intact. There's some that are missing. You can see it's a fixer-upper, but it's you get a sense of it being something, you know, that was able to accommodate and was very airy and give a lot of light and to those who were using it as a schoolhouse in its day. Next slide, please. And you can see from the roof, the image on the left shows that tapering of the rear of the building with the spaces on either side. And it's wedged in by, the school's wedged in by two buildings, the St. Francis Xavier's old school building on one side and a commercial and residential loft building on the other side of it. And this group shot is looking north towards the buildings that are on the north side of 17th Street, where Housing Works is, if that's familiar to you. So there you go. So thank you so much for hearing me out, and again for inviting me. And I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have about the school or some of the events or people that passed through.
Right. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, there's quite a few questions. All right. So about how many students attended the school in general, and was it co-ed, boys and girls? And usually, like, what age did they attend to, and what was some of the curriculum that they were taught at the school?
Is this okay? So you're gonna have to remind me of some of those questions. So in all the years that it was open, I'm gonna be very general and say there were hundreds that went through, because I don't have the stats in front of me for each term for each year, but there were literally hundreds. The ages were, so it was an upgrade, so it included both a primary school and a grammar school. So generally speaking, the ages were from about 4 or 5 to about, I think, 14 years of age. Roughly speaking. So it's adolescence. That evening school, I don't remember if I mentioned it or not, for adults, also was open to kids who were working kids, because working kids was a thing in that time. And if they were not able to attend school in the daytime, they were allowed, I think somebody had to vouch, an adult had to vouch for them for this fact, to take classes in the evening school at night. So they counted as much as well. But counting also the evening school, the ages, of course, were way beyond 14 years old, because as it was mentioned, there were people, in their 60s and 70s who were also attending classes there. The curriculum, that was one of the questions. It was the same standard curriculum that would have been taught in the general schools, in the white schools. Teachers got the same training, but at separate segregated colleges for teachers. But I like to think that the curriculum was different in the sense that while they were teaching the standard fare, some of the things that I mentioned, like some of the celebrations that they pay close attention to, like celebrating the anniversary of the 15th Amendment for years after its ratification. These were cornerstones, really benchmarks of the African-American experience. And they didn't take them lightly, and the students participated in that. There were theater outings, in some cases where they participated on stage. But I mentioned J.A. Arnaud, the Shakespearean actor. He had his own company. It's believed that his was the first Black Shakespearean company. It was called the Astor Place Tragedy Company. But he was a benefactor of the school. So they were exposed to that expressly. So I'd like to think that in terms of, if you consider these sort of extracurricular activities, that Garnett seems to have been very much an ardent supporter for. The curriculum was expanded beyond the standard. That little advertisement that I showed when I was talking about Walter F. Craig and Desideria Plato, which just mentioned the benefit to celebrate the missionary work, and that was their emphasis of Grammar School number 81. The missionary, in that sense, did not refer to religious work. It was sort of a term for the time for more or less meant activist work. And so it was very much an activist, very much instilled an activist mentality among the teachers and students of the school. So that was all considered, I think, part of the curriculum. That was not necessarily in the books, but it was considered, part of their civic duty to be aware of those things and to participate in civic life. I'm not sure if I got all those points that you asked.
Oh, you got all of it. Awesome. And was school number 4 connected in any way to the colored school in Weeksville, which ultimately burned down?
Yes, in the sense that they had the same general story. They were part of New York State, but at that time, Weeksville Brooklyn was its own city. It was a separate city until 1898. So there are some corresponding numbers, but they are different schools. So there was, they were connected in temperament, and a lot of the teachers lived locally, in Greenwich Village or in its environs, but also in Brooklyn. A lot of the teachers lived or had roots in Brooklyn, and in the social organizations, there was a very, very strong correspondence between the Manhattanites and the Brooklynites in the African American community. So they were not formally connected, other than that they were part of the New York system. But yes, they had a spiritual connection, if that's the right word for it.
And what year did the school close? And what happened to the building after the school closed? Did it just stay an abandoned building, or was it used for other things?
Oh, great question. So it was closed by legislature in 1894, and then Sarah Garnett and several of her staff moved over to Grammar School number 80, which had been Colored School number 3 on 41st Street, because the principal there, Charles Reason, had passed away in 1893. And the building then, rather than being, it was, Board of Ed said they were going to sell it and did not. It then went into the hands of these Civil War veterans, specifically the Zouaves, some call them the fire Zouaves. These are the ones you've seen. They wear these very colorful, flamboyant uniforms. They're often referred to as the fire Zouaves because they were often recruited from the city's firemen. And they used it as essentially a headquarters, a clubhouse, for some decades, until about, I want to say, the 1930s, when the Department of Sanitation took over the building. So in that black and white tax photo that I showed you, you can see where it says Department of Sanitation in the center of the building, but over the door it still says there's some reference to veterans, Fire Veterans Association. So I don't know if they were using it at the same time, or if it was just that the sanitation took over and they hadn't removed the previous sign. And it was used by sanitation until just a few years ago as what was known as a section station, which was essentially like I want to say, I don't want to say like a lunchroom, but it was a non-rigorous use where local sanitation workers could take breaks, maybe between shifts or what have you. And there's somebody here who can weigh in on that, who's my friend Robert Nagel, who might be able to put in the chat exactly what they did there. But I think a lot of that generally passive use is what helped to preserve it, because it wasn't being thrown around. I think had it remained a school all these years, it would be less likely to have survived all that student activity throughout.
And what are the plans for the restoration now? Is it going to be open to the public? Is it going to be restored to like the original interior, or is it going to be updated, modernized?
So that's the $1 million question, because there's been a general informal consensus that it ought to be used in some way that echoes its original use, which is to say that it is open to activities that include kids, but all families, not just as a Black space, but a space for all New Yorkers, that may be able to focus on highlighting 4 centuries of the Black experience in New York City. So that would encompass, an educational element, maybe an exhibition element, maybe performances. In terms of its rehabilitation, which is what Mayor Adams has pledged the $6 million towards, that hasn't been discussed yet. So it's still an open question. I'm very eager to be a part of that conversation, which just hasn't happened yet. But I think that's everyone's concern, because it's still in this state, while it's not being used, it's nothing stays idle anywhere. Nature starts to take over, and that's not always a good thing. So I will hopefully be hearing something that I can report back to sooner than later.
Fingers crossed. All right, these will be our last couple of questions. Was there any connection between the colored schools and the Black colleges and universities at the time?
You mean HBCUs in
Yes.
the South?
Yes.
No, not formal. But informally, certainly, because a lot of the teachers would have been associated with them. There was always a great correspondence and liaison between these groups. People who came to the city often stayed with people who were connected to the schools, because there were few places for Black travelers to stay. One of the people who was sort of an instrumental friend of the school, Peter S. Porter, who I write about in my book, he ran one of the most notable Black hotels. It was called Porter's Mansion on 26th Street at the time. So people came up, like, and groups of people, like the Hampton Jubilee Singers, when they were doing their world tour, they stayed in New York at his place. So they were not formally connected to them, but the informal connections were powerful. Sure.
And then this will be our final question for the evening. Were any school records found in the building itself? And for the surviving records, where can folks find them today, to conduct any research on them?
No, so no school records were found. I mean, because the building was had ceased to be to serve a school function since 1894. If anything were found, it would have been found by the Zouaves. They certainly did not survive. If anything's buried in any of those walls, that's another question. But the records are scattered. So a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, what I relied on were public records, a lot of newspaper accounts that I could use as sort of launch pads. A lot of the Board of Education records are part of the municipal archives. So I accessed a lot of those. But they're not necessarily specific to day-to-day activities going on in the schools. That they're more general things that are going on with the Board of Ed, which often concerns what's happening with the schools, or the school closing or somebody being hired, what they're being paid. There are directories that the Board of Ed published that lists what their salaries were, where their addresses, home addresses were. And those things are all very useful because they help to flesh out the individuals who populated this building.
Oh, awesome. Eric, thank you so much for that awesome presentation. It was so interesting. I first heard you when you did your presentation back in September at Jefferson Market Library. That's why I wanted to bring you here to Village Preservation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you
Absolutely.
all.
It's been a
I
real
can't see
pleasure.
you all, but I can see, you're numerous. So thank you.
And for any folks still on the line here, please join us next week on November 14th, Tuesday the 14th at 6 p.m. for a panel discussion, the uses, misuses, and limitations of Jane Jacobs. We actually have a very busy next week. This is why we have something on the 15th on 18th century remnants here in the village. And then we have a members program on the 16th as well. But thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Again, if you are a member, thank you so much for being a member. If you're not a member, shame on you, you should be one by now. Please scan that QR code and help us support programs like this. And again, Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this presentation. And thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.